Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, January 10th, 2013. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week, for the love of hops, author Stan Hieronymus joins us to talk about his latest book exploring the aroma, bitterness, and culture of hops. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. Also, you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. We have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing video page on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing. Thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. You know how it works. When you feel like Amazon shopping, don't go to Amazon.com first. Go to our site first, basicbrewing.com. Click on our Amazon banner. That will take you to Amazon.com, and then whatever you buy during that session, we'll get credit for and get a commission. So you'll be helping us to bring you this show without paying any extra, and so we greatly appreciate your support in doing that. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site, too. And our Basic Brewing iPhone app is on iTunes, and our Android app is on Amazon.com. We're on the BlackBerry Podcast Directory, and we're on the Stitcher app as well. Start your brewing year right with our newly designed Brewer's Logbook. Lots of you have done so already. The new version of the logbook has a calendar in the front with a 2-page per month format, so that you can keep track of a full year of brewing. And those calendar pages are blank, so you can start your year anytime. And in the back of the book are enough log pages to detail 50 batches of beer or mead. You could do mead, too. Also new is a table of contents on the inside covers, so you can find your batches very easily. And speaking of covering... How's that for a transition? Stan and I covered a lot, but I want to get to a couple of emails first. The first is a bit heavy, but I think it comes at a good time of the year. Jason writes, I'd like to remind all your listeners to please be careful with propane burners. This holiday season, I responded with my fire department to a CO call involving a VSA, or vital signs absent, patient. Because of the extreme cold, he was using his turkey fryer in an enclosed garage and died from exposure to the fumes it produced. So a reminder from the fire department to all your listeners, please only use propane stoves in a well-ventilated area and be aware of the signs and symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning. Jason says it's also unsafe to use open flame devices inside a residence. Have smoke and CO detectors installed and tested in your home to prevent the real homebrew disasters. So great advice for those who tend to move their propane burners inside the garage when it gets colder. Be very, very careful. We don't want something like that unfortunate incident happening to you. Then there's this more upbeat note. Chris writes, after hearing our show last week where archaeologist Ian Hill talked about using figs in brewing a Bronze Age-inspired beer. Chris says, I found this episode fascinating not only because I wanted to learn more about beers that were brewed in that region and era, but because I brewed a fig beer twice, and the second time took first place at a homebrewers festival. I used a Scottish ale as the base recipe and added a heap of figs in the secondary, even the leaves, which, as you know, are quite fragrant. I brewed it as an homage to my father, who loved figs. Very nice. How appropriate that Chris used a Scottish ale as a base, since Ian spoke to us from Scotland last time. I'm definitely going to put the figs that grow in my yard to good use this year, and I wouldn't have thought of putting leaves in there as well. Very interesting. Okay, we've talked to Stan Hieronymus in the past about his Brew Like a Monk book, and then his book on brewing with wheat. His latest title is For the Love of Hops, The Practical Guide to Aroma, Bitterness, and the Culture of Hops. Well, Stan Hieronymus, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
I'm happy to be back.
Yeah, this is, what, your third time on the show, officially?
Yes. And all I have to do is write a book and yet invite me to be on. Nothing could be simpler.
That's not your only motivation for writing the books.
To be honest, that is true.
Well, this topic, for the love of hops, that had to be an intimidating topic to tackle.
Most certainly. And the curious thing about it is it began. There was a proposed series for Brewers Publications, which yeast is already out, and now hops is out. Water by John Palmer and Colin Kaminsky likely will be available sometime next fall, and then following in spring will be the malt book by John Mallett. And to put this series together, and so I think the project started about 2006 or so, and Matt Brynildson was going to do the hops book, but he's kind of a busy guy, and it just wasn't coming together. And in a way, that was a break for the book. If he'd hurried and let's say in 2007 when I saw Ray Daniels sit down with him and look at his outline and written that book within the next year, we would have barely been at the hop crisis. We wouldn't be talking about hops like Citra and Mosaic. We wouldn't know the things that we know now about the impact that yeast have on creating these different aromas. There's new things we've learned about bitterness. Of course, breweries have pursued this is a scaling up and not that much use to homebrewers, but what's happening with dry hopping on a larger scale, and certainly the production of what hops are available has changed dramatically. In 2005, there were 100 acres of Centennial hops, and this year there were 1,500 acres of Centennial hops.
Wow! And the complexity of over time, it seems like the focus of hop growers was to create alpha acid in kind of a generic way, right? And the variation between those hops was less important than it is today, right?
Yes. Because that's what brewers were buying, and still worldwide, that's pale lagers dominate the landscape. So in much of the world, pale lagers contain, and this is not it when you talk about IBUs, that is not 100% the same as milligrams of isoalpha acids per liter, but it's pretty comparable. And worldwide, we're looking at hop usage that's about 8 milligrams per liter, so about 8 IBU. And hop usage in the last 100 years has shrunk from about where German lagers would have been about a half pound per barrel now, and ales, which would have been the UK, about a pound per barrel. On a worldwide basis, hop usage is about 2 ounces per. Are
you still with me?
I am.
Oh, okay.
That was curious, wasn't it? With that little drum sound or something like that. And I was thinking this was like the future of hops, which is what it looked like 20 or 30 years ago, that it was going to become totally a commodity, and that makes it really hard for the farmers to survive.
One of the things that had to be intimidating about the book, is that you talk about sort of our relationship with hops over history. And there really is no defined beginning point to that. Because it seems like human beings have been brewing with hops for a very long time.
Well, you think the way brewing was done, and there are not records. Hops been around more than 6 million years. So when they were first tossed into beer, we don't know. But the first records of hops being boiled, which is when we begin to get that's how you extract all the great attributes that hops give to beer. That's less than 1,000 years ago. So you pretty much start there, and not worrying about that history, even though some of that history is in the book, and it looks at the culture. It at least made the book a little bit shorter.
I mean, over time, hops have been credited for being a preventative for leprosy and a cure for the French disease.
Yes.
Which I assume is not rudeness.
It didn't work on rudeness.
But hops are kind of integrated into the culture in ways that I didn't expect or I was surprised by. For instance, the sock hop, the name of the dance craze in the 50s, I guess, came from an association with hops as well.
Yeah, certainly that's a bit of history that is just sort of in the book because I like it. But I do think it reflects when you start talking, as you know, first of all, when you show up at a party and you're the beer guy, then everybody has questions. That sort of becomes hops. People love to talk about hops, and they love the history of hops. And the hopping down to Kent in England when people would go from the city out into the country, get on a train and go out in the country and pick hops, make a little bit of money, and be out in the countryside. And that just has this wonderful pastoral appeal to us. Although, in fact, for the most part, those people were living in huts, and it was not a great vacation. But there's a certain appeal to that, and the past of hops, which it just gives us a personal association with the beer. In a way, some of that is coming back as brewers establish relationships with farmers, for instance, and breeders talk to brewers and say, what is it you want out of a hop? And it stands in contrast to the larger picture, which is production of alpha acid for boring beer.
I went up to Gorst Valley Hops.
Mm-hmm.
In talking to James Altweiss up there,
right.
They are establishing direct relationships with brewers, and kind of figuring out what the brewers want and tailoring their hop production around the weather, local climate, but also around what their customers want. And it's becoming a very sort of a business tailored to the end customer.
Yes, sir. For instance, Gail Goshi, who is a farmer in Oregon, and they're about 300 acres of hops, I think, and out of 1,000 acres on their farm. And she, as recently as 2008, I think, sold 80% of their hops to Anheuser-Busch, and were paid top dollar. Loved working with AB, and AB thought very highly of their product. So it was a great relationship. But when AB decided that they didnn want as much Willamette hops, then that picture began to change, and she began an association with craft brewers. The first was Larry Sador at Deschutes. When he came and sat down in it's sort of outside of her office, this little open area and table, and she brought out hops, and he put them in his hands and rubbed the hops. That was, and this is like 2009, that was the first time she'd ever seen, if the brewer's the end user in direct contact with her product. And that's what's certainly changing when brewers go and visit the farms. You can't have a bunch of home brewers trekking to these farms, although, say, sometime in August, pre-harvest, it would be pretty doable. And for small brewers, it certainly is doable, even though they are not contracting for large amounts, even though they aren't going to be able to tell a farmer, oh, I'd like this kiln at 3 degrees cooler, and I'd like it picked 4 days later. They're not going to have that kind of impact, but they're going to understand the hop as an agricultural product.
And homebrewers can't be trekking to the hop fields, but the effect of the craft brewers doing that is definitely going to have an effect on the products that we're able to buy in the store.
Exactly. But I would say that if it's possible sometime for homebrewers to go to, and it's basically the Northwest for the U.S., where you have, particularly Yakima, and you see these hops in the field, They do not look the same as your hops growing at home.
No.
And I at this point, they probably don't look like the hops growing in Wisconsin or northern Michigan, where people are doing hops, because the contrast between, say, the Kent region, which is it's seaside, and I tell you what, those hops have to be tough. They're on there and they just don't look as happy. And then you go over to the Hallertau, where they're growing these high alpha hops that just look like beast, and they're appropriately named, given names like Polaris, and in the case of the United States, Zeus, and they look like a hop tree, and the cones go from right to the base of the ground, and they totally fill up a particular vine. And not only that, but generally they're around 20 alpha acids.
Wow. Yeah, I grew my own hops for a few years before I went up to do the Hop Madness thing with Dave Wills from Fresh Hops. Mm-hmm. And man, I thought my hops looked pretty good, but man, these those are monsters up there. And like you said, cones all the way from the top to the bottom, and huge bunches of cones. But a lot of things are happening in the field that are really complex as far as what compounds are being created, and things like weather and the soil, and there is sort of a terroir that's going on with these hops. So not only do the growing conditions affect the quality of the hops and the compounds that are being created, but also how long they're being left on the vine before they're picked. You go into this a bit in the book, which is probably one of the reasons why this is such a challenging book to write, is that there are all these things going on in this very complex plant, and we're still discovering answering all the questions.
We're still asking the questions. But if you look back to the late 19th century, for instance, when you went to buy hops, basically you bought them on their color and what they look like, and that's why in some cases they were sulfured, which has the exact effect that you would think it does. It's not real good for hop aroma, but it kept the hops greener. Mm. And you continue until very recently with this perception that the way the hop looked, which meant picked earlier, was better. So, and much of this is the impact of Boston beer. In the Hallertau, picking dates have moved back considerably. In some cases, a few days, in some cases several days, and they are picked much later. And later picking can boost alpha a little bit, but what it's really doing is changing the oil complex.
And so if you're a home brewer and you're growing your own hops in your own yard, and you see those hops and they're nice and big and green, and you're just anxious to pick them before they start turning brown, what are the factors that you're working on there? I mean, what do you gain from waiting a little while longer on your own homegrown hops, say, so that they get a little uglier, but they're a little more mature?
Well, you're going to get a little bit more oils, and if you break a cone open and look at the lupulin, you can see that that's changing. That you're getting a little bit more of that, and that's probably the best indicator. So it depends what you want out of that hop. Not that it's easy to grow Saaz at home. In fact, I wouldn't suggest it to anybody. But if you're taking one of those, the landrace hops that some people call noble hops, then you're really not trying to push the oil content in those particular hops. But after you pick it and it begins to dry, that is when it's going to develop those other aroma characters as the oils that are already in there oxidize. But if you're doing Cascade or Centennial or Chinook, something like that, and you want to use those hops for dry hopping, which from a homebrew standpoint for late hopping or dry hopping makes calculating alpha acids, IBU, because you really don't know the alpha acids, much easier. Then, and you want that big punch in the nose impact, then you want to let them go as long as you can.
Mm-hmm. And if they're a little bit ugly, a little bit brown on the tips going into, into the drying process, so be it.
Yeah, you don't want to let them go too long because they can change the color of your beer. And at the point they're changing the color of your beer, that's a sign you might have got a little greedy.
But you want to dry them fairly quickly at not too high a temperature, and then the storage. I was really interested at the discussions about how long hops can and in what conditions they must be stored in to enable you to preserve all those delicate aromatics.
The sooner at the moment you consider them cold, that you want to get them into the freezer and compact them. Obviously, if you could pelletize them, that would be great, but that isn't happening. So compact it somewhat, thinking of it in terms of a baled hop, and certainly get them wrapped in something like Mylar. And then keep them cold until you're going to use them. That's because the important thing for growing hops at home is you're growing for aroma. You're growing for the aroma of your backyard, mm-hmm. and you want that to carry through, and you don't want to leave it in the freezer.
And say if you suck all the air out of the bag, if you use a vacuum sealer and freeze them after that, you say that if you open that bag. Once you open that bag, the hops are going to start degrading if they're exposed to oxygen.
Yes, although that's one plus of from a standpoint of using the flowers. And then of course you could suck the air back out. But I'd advocate using them as quickly as possible and as fresh as possible. But what really degrades quickly is pellets once they are out of that environment because they have so much more surface area. So they degrade even more quickly. So when you're buying pellets at home and in whatever, if you're getting them in 4 or 6 ounce packages and you don't quite use all those up, you should be thinking about your next brew as quickly as you can. And in the meantime, though, is still at least get them double bagged and back in the freezer rather than tossing them in the refrigerator or something like that. Matt Brindleson has a great example in the book talking about, and this is more an example of understanding when we talk about caddy, what does that mean? So if you open a sealed bag of Chinook and hopefully it will smell great, just have this fresh burst of fruitiness and maybe a little pine. You take that bag, don't close it, throw it in the fridge for just a few hours, bring it back out. That's caddy.
Wow.
And that's how quickly it can happen.
So if you're a home brewer, it seems like you're better off buying smaller bags than buying, say, a big bulk bag that you're going to be going back to over and over and over again over a long period of time.
Yeah, I think that's true. Practically speaking, it's better off if you can schedule your year of brewing and buy all your hops now, so they're shipping over cold days, so they're not getting warm on the way, and because you've got them always under your control, they're in your freezer. You know what's going on. Watch your inventory. You can do those sort of things, so you're keeping the hops as fresh as you can.
Now, the first chapter of the book, you start off not with the history and all, but you start off with a chapter on aroma. Why did you start there?
Because that's the most important thing right now. That's I looked at other outlines and eventually books organize themselves. This one sure tried not to, but you say what's the most important thing, and then we can go into the order, a little bit of the history, and breeding, which I never would have envisioned going in that I was going to end up talking to 9 different hop breeders, and find them all so fascinating individuals. But the first thing we need to talk about is what is the focus of hops right now, and what differentiates hops right now. Also, I certainly hope homebrewers find the book useful, and so far the people I've talked to do. And if you look at the audience that's going to buy this book in the next 3 to 5 years, probably it'll be more homebrewers than any other group, commercial brewers, and then a certain amount of hopheads who want to know just more about the plant and maybe aroma and understanding those things. But my focus in writing it is for the commercial brewer. What's important, because there are things in the book that homebrewers just can't make use of, like you're not going to go do hop selection, for instance. But right now, for commercial brewers, understanding what's going on with aroma is top of mind.
But there's plenty in there for the home brewer. I mean, for instance, the hop store section, where you go, alphabetically and go through all these different varieties of hops. Very useful if you're shopping, for hops for a hoppy IPA or something like that.
I don't want to discourage homebrewers. There's just maybe 10% of the book is just not, they're not going to go talk about. They would like more hang time on their hops. That part isn't practical, and they're probably not going to worry about the use of hop extracts and hop oils, those sorts of things. But those are a small percentage of the book.
And in the recipes, there are recipes in the back that are not calibrated for 5-gallon batches. You have to do some figuring if you're a home brewer to kind of apply those to your own system. But then again, there's some philosophy around that, and there's some explanations from the brewers, the professional brewers, on those batches that I think could help you out if you're trying to formulate your own recipes.
I've always had a problem with 5-gallon recipe because I can never hit 5 gallons. And the conversion for 5 gallons is 19 liters. Well, then when you go to another country like Poland or Italy and you talk to the homebrewers, they don't brew in 19-liter amounts. They brew in 20-liter amounts. So to me, those percentages, it's sort of personal preference to me to put it that way. And I know a lot of people who brew 10 gallons. And like I said, I never get 5.
One of the most interesting things that in the aroma chapter was that hop aroma enhances the perception of bitterness. In that, if you have 2 beers with the same measured IBUs and one smells more hoppy than the other, the beer drinker will consider the hoppier smelling beer to be more bitter.
Yeah, I think practically speaking, and when they're saying that, what's happened is people are talking about hop presence. When they talk about bitterness, if you isolate that, you have them hold their noses, then they aren't going to see that difference. And German food scientists who have done a lot of the research into bitterness perceptions, and they're the ones who have isolated the tongue has bitterness receptors all over it and in your mouth. There are about 25 genes related to bitterness, 3 of them specifically to hop bitterness. And in doing that research, what they found is that they'll pull receptors out that they know perceive hop bitterness. When I say pull them, they'll take them off the tongue, grow them up. I think there's like a cow stomach or something like that involved. And then dose those receptors and see how they react to the bitterness. This is isoalpha bitterness. And they can see how they're doing that. They go back to the human mouth and see what happens, and it changes because your brain is, it's basically, the excretion through the mucus glands. So that's mitigating bitterness to begin with. So they found that probably the edge of perception of bitterness is 50 to 60 milligrams per liter, which would be comparable, and that's because of the math IBUs is so strange, but we'll say that it's like 60 IBU. Above 60 IBU, you're not going to perceive any more bitterness, but you certainly can perceive more hoppiness.
That's a good point. So once your tongue quits tasting it, your nose can help out.
Right, exactly, and so you're going to get that flavor. So, it bothers me that a brewer will list a beer as being 82 IBU when it has not been measured in a lab. But it is a little bit of a sign to a consumer that we used a lot of hops. I just saw somebody will send out a press release that says we use so many pounds of hops in a batch. But of course, the next question is, what was the batch size?
Yeah.
But I do think it's meaningful to say that if Lagunitas is using 2 to 2.5 pounds of hops per barrel in their IPA, that has meaning to people. A lot of that isn't going to bitterness. That's going to flavor and aroma.
And even you were talking about Deschutes. You said the brewers in 2008 they brewed a batch with 243 calculated IBUs, which in the lab measured at 117 in the fermenter, and then the bottled beer contained only 87 measured. The calculation, the formulas apparently weren't hitting the number, and then by the time the beer went through the brewing process and the fermentation process and then the bottling process, the amount of IBUs was significantly cut as well, which is something that homebrewers probably should be thinking about too. But and you touched on a pet peeve of mine in the book, the story about the homebrew competition where they said this beer measures such and such IBUs, and somebody asked, well, which formula did he use to calculate? It's frustrating to me that there is this situation where these formulas are out there and they give radically, sometimes, depending on when you put the hops in, radically different numbers on the calculated IBUs. At some point, are we going to have to find a new paradigm on figuring out how much hops to add into the beer, or how useful can it be if you get different results for different formulas? You see what I'm saying?
I do. I think a key thing for anybody is to say, why am I using this formula? And then find one formula that you like and seems to dial into you, and that becomes the formula you're using over time. So, let's say I've got a recipe for a great pale ale, and it includes Centennial. And last year my Centennials were 8.2 alpha acids, and this year they're 9.8. Well, that formula will allow me to make the adjustments I need to, because most of the variations in those formula are utilization. So if I haven't changed my system, my utilization is the same. If I use the same formula, I'll know how much to dial back the hops. And at that point, it becomes a useful formula. If I'm using the formula, writing a recipe, that's when you need to figure out that it's in tune with your thinking. The perception of bitterness is such a moving target that to think that you're being exact between 35 BUs and 39 BUs is sort of ludicrous. But it tells you you're going to be in the ballpark. And so picking one formula and going on that and then not stressing too much is, and I talked to Glenn Tinsis just briefly, and talking about those formulas. And I'm sure some homebrewers will be disappointed that I haven't gone back and carefully analyzed and compared those formulas, which has been going on pretty much relentlessly for the last 15 years. And that's not a conversation I cared to repeat. You can go in and read those conversations. The formulas are good. Pick one and understand how it works for your own purposes. And then don't walk around talking about IBU. I mean, IBU was meant as an internal control. And it'd be fine. It makes much more sense if you, although the shorthand is nice and people have got used to it, instead of saying, and I'm thinking about commercial brewers here, instead of saying that we've got, and to go back to Lagunitas, because they put those silly numbers, 68.5 IBU or 68.77, I think, on some of their labels, to say we're using this much hops, this quantity of hops. And by the way, on a worldwide basis, and the conversion is totally imperfect now, you just have to say it's like 2 ounces, because they don't use a weight of hops. They use alpha acids. And this book, and that's one thing I think that unites, and I think would be true even for consumers who don't brew beer. This is a book for people who buy their hops by the pound, not by alpha acids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think as far as the IBU formulas are concerned, in my mind, I find them most useful for calculating the bitterness addition at the beginning of the boil, and not so much the later additions. But there's another thing that you opened up in the book that I've been meaning to play with, and that is first wort hopping. You go into that a bit. And when I first heard about first wort hopping, that's where you put the hops in as you're collecting the wort from the mash tun before you bring them up to boil. And when I first heard about it, I think it was a presentation at the Homebrew Conference by Matt Brennelson, and he was talking about the different flavor characteristics that you get from this. And I was really skeptical because, they teach us in the books and such that if you add hops to the beginning of the boil, all the character but the bitterness is lost over the boil. But apparently, if you add the hops before the wort comes up to boiling, when it's, say, at 170 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever.
Right. Everything before it begins to isomerize.
Right. Different things are going on, and you talk a bit about the chemistry of that. Now, what's going on there, and what's the effect?
Well, quite honestly, it's not clear. It may be related to this concept of hop glycosides, which are water soluble and split off. So maybe you're getting some of those, and it becomes, as much as anything, it adds a crispness and a mouthfeel. It's a package of what you get from the hop. And some of that is this, when you think about if you have some of the Victory, Prima Pils is pretty crisp, but it's also much stronger. So if you're lucky enough to get one of the 5% beers that Victory does, with a variety of different hops, or Pikeland Pils, that is certainly the Hop Switch Pilses here at Urban Chestnut down in Texas. So there's some excellent Pilsners down there. They've got this crispness to them. And I think that's as much texture as it is aroma or flavor, and that's one of the things that you're getting out of that first wort. But you're certainly getting a little bit more of those oxidized compounds that we refer to as herbal sometimes, and we associate with again, quote, noble hops.
So it appears to be a real thing.
It's a real thing.
And mash hopping doesn't seem to give you any added effects or positive effects?
It's given the fact that most people are using mash hopping. Well, you could use mash hopping if you're doing a Berliner Weiss, or if you're thinking in terms of sour beers, and particularly if you're using whole hops and want to add a little bit more texture and polyphenols. It makes sense in that case, but it's not going to add any more bitterness. The most effective way, the curious thing about first wort, if you look at formulas and when you talk to people how to calculate the bitterness that first wort is adding, and they'll say that's like the 10-minute edition or the 20. And this goes back to what you were saying before, that they become less useful once they're not straight at the bittering edition. But they'll say, no, that's like the 10-minute edition or the 20-minute edition. Wrong. It's stronger than the 60-minute edition. You're going to get more isomerization. Mm-hmm. You're going to get more measured bitterness, but that bitterness is going to be perceived differently.
Interesting. I'm going to start playing with that. That's on my list now. Every time I talk to you, I get new stuff to do in the brew house, which is good. Now, let's talk about late wort hopping versus dry hopping. I mean, and each one of these questions I ask you, we could delve into for another show, but I just want to, kind of skip along the high points here. Talk about the sort of differences that you get and the debate between late wort hopping and dry hopping.
Well, there's a lot of that isn't backed up by data at this point. There's a sense, and again, it really depends. Let's talk about the home brewer first. If you're brewing beer and with a lot of hop character, and it's just for friends, and you're ripping through it, then your concerns about stability are pretty small. If you're brewing beer and you want to send it off for a competition, and then let's say it's a national, so a month later you want to send that same beer on, then at that point stability starts to become an issue. Mm-hmm. So there is some concern for the home brewer, but it's much more for the commercial brewer. When you look at this great interest in American hop-centric beers in England and on the continent now. And so people are starting to ship their beer farther. And for that matter, it's a ways from California to Virginia. And how long is that beer going to stand up? So you have a brewer, for instance, like Odell, which uses a hopback. So there's a lot more late wort in there. And their beer really seems to stand up over time. So you begin to ask yourself, why is that? Is what is it in the late wort that makes that a little bit more stable? And certainly it's spending more time in contact with the yeast. It's developing slightly different compounds. And what you're dry hopping with is the first one that's going to go away, and perhaps it's going to oxidize into some very unpleasant aroma as well. So some of the research is going on right now in Belgium is, and this is in connection with Proof, and Proof makes a lot of the beers that we get here. If you're looking at the labels all the time, you'll see that people are, they have two different size breweries, so you can make smaller batches or larger batches. And a lot of people have their beer made at Proof. Proof is like, they are at the forefront of beer science. And they are taking, doing experiments with late hopping and dry hopping, and they are finding that it is certainly varietal dependent. Mm. Some work better as a late hop, some work better as a dry hop. At this point, they don't want to talk about the varieties because they don't want to brand something as, I don't want to use Summit.
Yeah,
I can throw that out because Summit's already been branded. So I think going forward, hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll begin to understand that a little bit better.
But just at a glance, it appears that dry hopping is less stable than late wort hopping.
Yeah, well, for what? Yes. The bottom line is yes.
And there's some things going on. I mean, and someone is quoted, I can't remember who, but is quoted as saying that, say, a super hoppy, dry hopped double IPA will lose enough hop character in just a few days to make it taste like just a regular pale ale.
Right. But that's if you go from yes. And those are experiments at Sierra Nevada, and what they're looking at is how much you're losing in the headspace, and then how much you're losing through the crown. And so you make a decision what you want to use as far as a crown. Again, homebrewers don't have quite the flexibility of the large brewers, and that's why a keg is so much more stable. And then what they've done is seeing what happens when you shake that beer up. Again, if you're a home brewer, you're sending your beer to a competition, and UPS is relentlessly removing hop character from your beer as it heads off to wherever it's going to be judged.
Yeah, you quote one brewer as saying the first thing he does when he opens a bottle of beer is to smell the cap, to smell the liner.
That's Tom Nielsen at Sierra Nevada, and so there is that loss, but there's still a lot left. And there is a story in the Aroma chapter that explains exactly why less is more. So it is possible to overload your beer with hop aroma. And when you do that, I wouldn't say it shuts down the nose, but it overwhelms some of the aroma receptors. And it changes their perception or your perception. It changes what they send to your brain that they're smelling. So that you need to adjust that anyway. So I wouldn't advocate that people go, oh, I'm going to lose all this hop aroma. I need to throw in even more dry hop. You need to find that sweet spot, and that sweet spot may be a beer that you got to drink between 27 and 32 hours after you package it.
Yeah, so we may be encouraging homebrewers to go to kegging.
For beers like that, I do think they hold up a lot better, and I certainly, I've tasted a few beers from people, and then I know I caught them in competitions. This is just a little over a month ago, and those same beers were somewhere in there in the competition, and throughout the competition, I was thinking these people need to use more hops.
Now, you also talk about an experiment that was it Rock Bottom did on the post-boil edition of hops?
Right, and then again, what they come back with, and of course everybody in the chapter on dry hopping is dry hopping is not linear. It becomes much less efficient as you add more in, and the Rock Bottom experiment indicated that a combination of late hops and dry hops probably had more impact, and then of course it also has greater stability. So that's a double plus.
Yeah, when we're taught as homebrewers to cool down the wort as quickly as possible. But in looking at the results of this experiment, it may, if you're going to add hops, say in the whirlpool, or mimic adding in the whirlpool if you're a home brewer, it would look like spending more time in that cooling off phase and not cooling the beer as quickly may give you better results.
Again, for instance, Firestone Walker gets a ton of utilization in their whirlpool. And Matt talks about when he was at Goose Island, and Hawker's Ale got like 28 BU out of 32 BU from the whirlpool edition. But if you count the time from knockout and then include the whirlpool to where it's finally a temperature below isomerization, it's often 45 minutes to an hour at a commercial brewery. So yeah, you do have those concerns from a home brewer of how quickly to cool them off. But certainly that whirlpool character, which has not been perfectly measured, but when you think about the quality of for instance, Firestone Walker beers, and you go, man, that's just got this beautiful hop aroma, smell, that crisp flavor, and everything. You got to think that might be a factor.
And what's the temperature? What's the sweet spot as far as utilization is concerned?
Well, you're gonna. I think it's if you stay about 185 somewhere in there, you're going to get some. It's not as efficient. Until recently, we lived in New Mexico, and we boil at a lower temperature, and you realize you're never going to get as good of utilization. But you're not necessarily going for utilization. Again, it's not measured at this point. You're going for everything you get from the hop.
Yeah, and again, it's you tailoring your own recipe for your own system, and your own circumstances. A recipe that you brew and hone over time may not be exactly the same as someone across the country or around the world, but it's all up to you. I mean, you're not if you're a home brewer and you're not putting numbers on the label and such as that. It's more like cooking. It's more the ingredients that work in that particular recipe, and if you keep going back to it and tweaking it over time, that's the way you get better beer.
Exactly, until the city screws with the aquifer.
Which is when you go to bottled water, and and that's John Palmer's book. Yeah. Well, man, there's just so much in this book that, and we talked about you maybe coming back, here in a couple 3 months and kind of updating on new stuff that you find. But man, the information that's in here is just very deep and thought-provoking. And again, this is the third book that you've written that we've talked about, and you continue to impress me, Stan.
Just don't ask me what's next. I don't know. Hops too.
Yeah, well, it's once you run out of the Reinheitsgebot ingredients, and then you start having to get wacky. So
that's all right. That's Randy's. Randy owns that domain. I think there's like if I go near one of those, a lawyer shows up at my door. Randy owns this.
If you say the word radical too close to the word brewing, you get in trouble.
Yes, and that's fine by me. He's really got it figured out, and I don't know if you've had a chance to try any of the Five Rabbit beers yet out of Chicago that he's doing the recipe formulations for. And some of them, you'll go, oh, this seems like something I tasted 10 years ago as a homebrew. They're really nice.
Oh. Well, that may warrant a trip to Chicago.
Yes.
Well, Stan, I appreciate your time, and let's plan to get back together and talk more.
That sounds excellent to me. I tell you what, somebody says, let's talk about hops, I show up.
Thanks, Stan.
All right, my pleasure.
Well, thanks again to Stan. There really is a lot of good information in that book, and we just barely scratched the surface. Hops are really complex, and when it comes to hops and their use, I wouldn't be surprised if there were a follow-up book, because brewers are constantly pushing the envelope and discovering new things. And I look forward to catching up with Stan again. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site. We've got combo deals to save you a few bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time. You can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store, too. And as I said at the beginning of this show, our new Brewers Logbooks are going out the door. So start tracking your brews now. You will not be sorry. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Run Like a Mother, How to Get Moving, and not lose your family, job, or sanity. And Bob's Red Mill Triticale Rolled Flakes, 16-ounce pack of 4. Since it's a pack of 4, would it be Quadro Triticale? I wonder if anybody gets that. Thanks again, and remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We greatly appreciate your support. Don't forget you can also join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com as well. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.